So this is 3 one-hour classes, basically. This first class is going it's going to go from the medieval period from 500, that's the fall of Rome, until 1400. There's another class that is Renaissance and Baroque, going from 1400 to 1800. And then the final class takes us from the Age of Revolution right up to our crazy time. I do want to stress that there are going to be no tests, okay? This is fun. I'm going to compromise a little bit on completeness and accuracy just to make it really simple so you can get your brains around it. We're not scholars here. We're Eurocentric, and we're talking about what really matters to your sightseeing. And we're going to take this sweep, and it's going to be very practical. The textbook for today's talk is Europe 101. This is the book we've written after 25 years of guiding groups around Europe, understanding what you need to know, and just as importantly, what you don't need to know to really understand and enjoy your sightseeing. So let's head on out, and the first thing we're going to talk about is Europe in the year 500. Now, in the year 500, Rome has fallen, right? Rome goes for 1,000 years, from 500 BC to 500 AD, and then the Middle Ages go from about 500 for another 1,000 years, from 500 AD to 1400 AD. The first half of that period, roughly 500 to 1,000, is what is popularly called the Dark Ages. Of course, it's not that dark, but compared to everything else, it's pretty dark. So we'll call it the Dark Ages, 500 to 1,000. Then things kick into gear in 1,000, and we get some very exciting culture and art in the High Middle Ages. And that takes us from 1,000 to 1,400, when the Renaissance starts, and that in a lot of ways is the start of our modern world. Now, when Rome fell, it was replaced by the Roman Catholic Church in a lot of ways. I mean, I love this photograph here, or this painting. You'll find it in the Vatican, and it shows what is the remains of a broken classical column laying on the floor, knocked over and replaced by a crucifix. And in a lot of ways, that's what happened. Rome fell, and the Roman Catholic Church carried on. The Pope was called the Pontifex Maximus, and the Roman Emperor was called the Pontifex Maximus. You had all the Roman senators, and then you had all the Roman Catholic bishops and archbishops. So there's a lot of that echo of Rome carrying on. When we think about how important Rome was 2,000 years ago, we got to remember Rome didn't mean the city of Rome. Rome meant the entire civilized world. Everything from a Eurocentric point of view, and that's what we are today, everything was either Roman or it was barbarian. Here we see the Roman Empire at the height of the time in the Pax Romana, the first 200 years after Jesus, and we can see Rome is right in the middle of it, but Rome spread all through that area, and when Rome, during that period, everybody who spoke Latin or Greek was civilized. Everybody beyond that was barbarian, bar, just like animals. Now, when Rome fell, you have the Christian church coming in and taking the remnants of Rome and conquering it visually, conquering it physically. You got Trajan's column here in Rome. What's on top? Is it a statue of Emperor Trajan, or is it a statue of St. Peter? St. Peter. It used to be Trajan. They took him off and they put Peter up there. So time and time again, we see this Roman thing. Now, when you think about the Dark Ages, my frustration in teaching the Dark Ages when I was first doing this was I wanted to do it all chronologically. It doesn't work chronologically. It all falls apart. That's why it's dark. So we think of that whole body of time from 500 to 1,000 as just a bunch of splotches all over the place. I'm talking from a practical travel point of view. What do we need to know? Look at the map. You've got Rome is just an insignificant little city at this point. You've got the eastern half of the Roman Empire living on from present-day Istanbul. You've got Islam cutting across Africa and moving into Spain. You've got all sorts of movements of tribes, Magyars and Slavs. And remember, this is when bullied tribes would move around and weak tribes would get shoved around, and there wasn't fixed borders. You had Celtic people. I like to think nice Celtic people all over Britain, and then the Angles came in, and they were tougher, and they pushed the Celtic people that were there first into the less desirable fringes, and they settled down in the harder-to-farm Scotland, Wales, and Ireland, and the Angles took the better land, Angleland, or England, you see. You have the Vikings way up in the north, miserable farm country up there. They're good at boating. They get in their boats and they rape, pillage, and plunder instead of farming. You've got the Moors pushing into Spain. You've got the only guy important to remember who's an emperor and that a leader in the Middle Ages, Charlemagne, ruling from France and a little bit of Germany there in the year 800. You've got the city of Venice emerging as a big power, and you've got Aix-la-Chapelle, which would be the capital, the early capital of Europe, where Charlemagne held his court. So these are some of the ideas. When we think about that map in the Dark Ages, we got to remember Rome was falling, and the Roman emperor said, "I'm out of here." And he moved over to Constantinople. It was called Byzance or something way back then. And he said, "I'm going to name this Constantinople, the city of Constantine." So Emperor Constantine, the first Christian emperor, by the way, set up shop in present-day Istanbul. Rome continued to fall, and Eastern Rome, which became the Byzantine Empire, lived on for 1,000 years. Christian and the echo of Rome, in a way, the Roman Empire surviving in the East. You can see that in present-day Constantinople. When you think about the art of the Byzantine Empire, Ravenna was the western sort of capital of the Byzantine Empire, and there you'll find sumptuous art giving us a sense of how rich and exquisite life was in Byzantium. Remember, for 400 years, when Christians were just rutting in the mud in Europe, they looked at Constantinople as the leading city of Christendom, all right? Istanbul today. And we can see that Byzantine art when we're in Italy, in Ravenna. When we look at this art, this is the end of the ancient era and the beginning of the Middle Ages. This is around the year 500. You can tell that because Jesus is portrayed beardless in the ancient world, and he's portrayed bearded in the medieval world. And this is in the same church, artists working in the same generation on the cusp between ancient and medieval. Another little trick, when you look at a mosaic or a painting and you see a bunch of religious people with halos, the guy with a cross in his halo, it's always Jesus. Only Jesus gets a cross in his halo, so there you've got one of the people that you're looking at in all those mosaics and stained glass figured out. Okay, so we have these beautiful mosaics in exquisite time. And when we think about the Byzantine civilization, here we see the standard for the next 1,000 years, more than 1,000 years. It's the church and the emperor ganging up on the people. Okay, here we got Justinian. He's the emperor. He's wearing a crown and he's wearing a halo. He is both holy and secular. And you've got the leading church powers and you got the leading secular powers right here. This is the original 1%, okay? You've heard about that, you know, the 99. Well, the 99's going to raise their head later, but now for a long time, the vote is always 2 against 1. The church and the government against the people, all right? And that's kind of the status quo. Until we get to the age of revolution, we'll talk about that. Now, when it comes to the church, the Christian church in this day when there's a lot of pre-Christian and pagan religions going on, it had to be pretty aggressive. And Jesus is often portrayed as a soldier. In fact, here in this mosaic, you see Jesus dressed up like a Roman soldier, holding the cross as if it's a sword, standing on symbols of evil, and on the book it says, "I am the way, the light, the truth, and the life." You see, this is really powerful art, and it's very exciting to see how the church establishes itself in that crazy world when Rome fell and there was just chaos, a vacuum, no real successful or established government. Now, when we've got the Dark Ages, Europe is deep into the Middle Ages now. The power of Rome's gone. In the 7th century, in present-day Saudi Arabia, Muhammad comes along. He establishes the Muslim faith, and that faith travels like wildfire across Africa. You can think how fast some of the Muslim extremists can travel these days when they're on the war path, right? Well, this happened in Europe, and within 100 years, Islam had spread from Mecca all the way across Africa into Spain, through Spain, and well into France. For 700 years, the Europeans were united in the effort to push those Muslims back out of Europe and back into Africa, where they came from. That's called the Reconquista. 711, the Muslims came across the Strait of Gibraltar. 1492, they were finally pushed the other way. One good way to get everybody on the same team is have a common enemy. Right? You can see it in present-day politics, and back then, everybody was on board against the threat. both from the east and from the south, coming in, Islam threatening Christian Europe. This is the famous palace of the last Moorish stronghold in Granada. When you ask a European what happened in 1492, they don't think about Columbus. That was the year they finally pushed the Moors back into Africa, away from this palace, the Alhambra. Now, the Moors have a huge impact on European culture. Very sophisticated, beautiful culture in so many ways, very smart. A lot of the great thinking of classical Greece was lost to Europe, absorbed into Islam, and given back to Europe through the Moors in Spain. Now, of course, when you have Moorish art, it cannot have pictures of people or statues. You have calligraphy, you have Quranic verses, you've got propaganda phrases, you've got praises of praise, praises about the prophet, and so on. And when you go to a church, you'll see a statue of St. Peter or a statue of Jesus or Mary. You go to a mosque, you can't see a statue. What you see is a banner with calligraphy writing in a very beautiful way that would say Muhammad or whoever, whatever prophet they're celebrating. So it's equivalent of a church, but they can't have images, so you get the calligraphy, and you see that in those mosques. Now, for 700 years, Christians were pushing the Muslims back out, and it was quite a struggle. A hero of this Reconquista was a guy named Santiago Matamoros, St. James the Moor Killer. And these days, you go to Spain, you sit in a church. This church is built on the ruins of a destroyed mosque, which is built upon the ruins of a destroyed church, which is built upon the ruins of a Roman temple, which was probably built on the ruins of something holy there before the Romans came, you see. And you've got the current church there now, and in a niche, you see a guy on a horse rearing back with a sword up above and the freshly cut off heads of a bunch of Muslims at the feet of the horse. So cutting off heads in a crusade is nothing new, and you'll be surrounded by cut off Muslim heads as you worship in churches in Spain. This is fascinating stuff when you're interested in history and what's going on today. Across Spain, you've got that Reconquista. An entire region of Spain is called Castile, and you'll find a lot of castles there that date back to that struggle. In fact, there's a lot of towns called de la Frontera. Jerez de la Frontera, Vejar de la Frontera, Arcos de la Frontera, and so on. Towns that were established on the frontier. The frontier pushed further down. They're embedded in Christian Spain, and they still got the name de la Frontera, on the frontier, a souvenir from pushing the Moors back out. Now, when Christian Europe finally retook Spain, there was a lot of Moorish civilization and artisans and crafts and aesthetics that stayed. And they were just incorporated into Christian and Jewish society, and many of the churches and synagogues that were built after that actually were built by Moorish craftspeople, and you'll see that Muslim style carrying on after the Reconquista. When Rome fell, you had all this chaos, and there's all these barbarians tromping on meek, nice people's farmlands and burning their houses and so on. On the mainland near present-day Venice, farmers got sick and tired of getting run over by the barbarians. They said, this is going to be miserable, but let's move out into the lagoon and hope the barbarians don't like water. And they deforested that part of Italy, pounding in all the trees to make a foundation so that they could build their little houses. And the farmers became fishermen. And eventually they became great traders. They had a real knack for that. And by about the year 800 or 900, Venice was a huge, sprawling trading empire. Eventually it went as far as the Holy Land. And it was the economic power in Europe in the year 1000. And when you go to Venice today, you'll get a sense of that. You'll see St. Mark's Basilica. Now, Venice was an important place politically, important place economically, but no importance religiously, because it was an upstart town, kind of refugee town. Nothing important happened there in the Bible, so they don't have any relics. Bad news if you're a self-respecting town, you need relics. I don't know if they had newsletters or what, but they became aware that the bones of St. Mark were available down in Egypt. So they sent a crew down to Egypt, and they rescued the bones of St. Mark. They brought him back to the basilica, and when you enter the basilica today, you see a mosaic over the door, and this goes back about 1,000 years. And if you look closely at that mosaic, in the middle, right under Jesus, blessing the whole thing, is the coffin of St. Mark. And the big shots of the town are literally carrying him into the church. They planted him under the altar, and that put Venice on the map from a pilgrimage point of view. And now Venice is a decent, powerful town because it's got relics, it's got political and economic power, and you've got all sorts of glory plastered all over that church. Small windows, gold leaf mosaics, letting the light that can squeeze in bounce around a lot. and it is filled with riches. When you go to Venice, you'll remember it was a military superpower in its day, an economic powerhouse in the day, to the point that it could scare away potential adversaries just by inviting them over, taking them to the arsenal, and showing them their very early form of mass production. With an assembly line kind of production, they could crank out a warship every couple of days. A potential adversary came to Venice, they wined and dined him, let him see the production of a warship, and then they rigged it and outfitted it, and it's just ready to go to defend the city. And that guy went home and said, don't mess with Venice. Let's find somebody else. Venice was incredibly powerful. You can see the gate of the arsenal today when you go, and when you travel around Venice, you can see the result of all those riches. Time and time again, you'll notice it takes money to have things to look at 1,000 years later. The places that had trade, the places that had money, have the most great buildings to see. Venice had the most money. They've got the most fantastic buildings, and you'll see this fanciful Venetian Gothic all over the place. I mentioned the Vikings up in Norway. Now, the Vikings lived in very rough terrain. They were really good at shipping, and they had a huge impact on Europe. They sailed down rivers into Russia. In fact, the word Russia is a Viking word. They sailed all the way to Sicily. They established a city and a society in England. Jorvik was a Viking town originally 1,000 years ago. And they settled in Normandy. And for generations, they terrorized Europe around Normandy today in France and so on. As a matter of fact, for generations, the standard close of a prayer in Europe was not Amen, but it was, and deliver us from the Vikings, Amen. Those Norsemen, rape, pillage, and plunder. That's what they were good at. And they established themselves in Normandy. That's from the word Northman. And they were assimilated eventually. And then in 1066, it was the Normans that invaded England, right, for the Norman conquest. The Vikings had great ships, and you can see those ships up in Norway and in Denmark. And when you travel around anywhere north of the barbarian Roman line, I want you to remember that barbarians are kind of put down by history because they couldn't write their history. But they really had some exquisite art. And when you go into barbarian Europe and you look at old stuff, you got to give an opportunity for the barbarians to shine, okay? A beautiful aesthetic in the wood carving that survives from the Viking Age in Norway. When the Vikings were finally Christianized, that's considered the beginning of the Middle Ages, coming out of the ancient world into the Middle Ages, and then they put their woodworking techniques to building churches. You can see a little bit of their shipbuilding technique in their churches. This is a stave church. Now, the big ruler of the Dark Ages is Charlemagne. Charlemagne is the only guy you got to remember in the Dark Ages from a who's the king point of view. Charles the Great, Carlos Magnus, Charlemagne. Charles the Great ruled the Franks. He was crowned in the year 800. The Pope came up from Rome and crowned him in Paris. And this was a time when the Pope was needed to legitimize the Emperor, and the Emperor was needed to legitimize the Pope, so they kind of worked together. Charlemagne was an effective ruler because he stayed on the road. Remember this whole term, a room fit for a king? Back then, if you just sat in Paris, you could say you ruled everything, but in effect you didn't. You had to be out there moving and asserting your power. That's what Charlemagne did. Remember, in the darkest depths of the Dark Ages, the people in Europe knew they were in a middle time. They even referred to themselves then as some kind of medieval society. The Middle Ages, they knew there was something greater before them because they're sitting on the ruins of Rome, and they knew they were in the doldrums now, but every time they had a little excitement going on, they would shiver and drool with enthusiasm and think maybe this is the Renaissance, and then it would be a false start. Okay, they had a little false start during the Carolingian time. When you hear the word Carolingian, that's from the reign of Charlemagne, okay? The real Renaissance was not going to happen, though, for 600 more years until 1400. To give you an idea of the importance of monks during this period, every effective ruler needed to have scribes. The educated elites in Charlemagne's administration were imported from Ireland. These were Irish monks. During the darkest depths of the Dark Ages, literacy was almost snuffed out. And conscientious objectors to all that darkness and chaos, thoughtful, bookwormy type people, checked into monasteries. And they lived monastic lives, intellectual lives, and what they did to earn their keep was transcribe books. They would write out the books. This was a time when educated people spoke Latin across Europe. Not many people were reading and writing, and most of those who were associated with the church. The island of Ireland is called the Isle of Saints and Scholars. And when Europe was pretty much illiterate, Ireland is remarkably sophisticated. And when you go there today, you'll see a lot of very interesting little monastic fortress communities that 1,000 years ago were bright spots in the Dark Ages. Remember, probably the most important kind of painting in the Dark Ages is what we call illuminated manuscripts. There was no way to print a book except to handwrite it. Not many people were smart enough to handwrite. These were monks in the monasteries that were scribes like this. And it was boring work all day long, just writing stuff out. When they got to a new chapter, oh man, I want to do something a little more creative. Let's make a picture. So they do a funny picture or a fun picture on the chapter head, and then they'd get back into the hard business of transcribing the rest of that book, you see. The illuminated manuscripts, those paintings, those illuminated cover pages are the beautiful art of this period, and you'll see a lot of that in your travels. Now, when Rome fell, there was a power vacuum. You can have a problem with government, you can complain about government, but try having no government at all. If you have no government at all, you would wish for the government we have today, believe it or not. When Rome fell, there was this power vacuum. What do? You got to have some semblance of order, so they had feudalism. Now, Europe is fragmented. Remember, it is just, people run for the hills. It used to be down in the valleys, now there's no order, so people run for the hills, and we start these hill towns. All over Southern Europe you find hill towns. Remember, in the Middle Ages, the only way to transport things safely and economically was on rivers. So towns would grow up on rivers. Rivers were good because they would turn your wheels and they would give you power. And of course, you could get water from the rivers. So it made sense to build on a river. Paris was born on a river, like so many other great cities. Originally, in the island in the middle of the river, the Ile de la Cité. Then it grows bigger, and it has to grow outside of the natural fortification or the moat caused by the river going around the island, and they have to build walls to protect it. Today, of course, the city grows way beyond those walls, and what they do is they tear down those walls, and you have circular boulevard to help alleviate traffic congestion. All over Europe, when you look at maps of great cities, you can see the medieval wall embedded in the city, usually coming out from the river. This is Vienna. You got the river. You've got the cathedral, which would be the center point of that if it was what it would spin around. And then you've got the Ringstrasse. And the Ringstrasse was the former wall. Of course, when the city grows beyond that, it's congested. You need to tear down that wall. And a beautiful thing about tearing down a wall is you would always, when you built a wall, have a huge no man's land beyond the wall as far as you could shoot an arrow. If they let people build within that no man's land, it was built on the condition that if we are under attack, we get to tear down your house because we don't want any of the enemy getting close to the wall without us seeing it. So you have the big no man's land plus the wall, oftentimes with a series of moats. You tear down the wall, you get the no man's land, and suddenly you got all that real estate in the center of an important city that you can build on. When you look at Vienna, you've got the ring road, and it is lined with the greatest buildings in Vienna today. All the governmental buildings, the great museums and so on, are built on land that was just free for the taking when they took down their wall, and that's the wonderful string of buildings along the Ringstrasse in Vienna. Here we take a look at Florence. Now, when you go to a city like Florence, you feel like, oh, this is exhausting, it goes forever. Scissors it out in your mind, just around that circular road defined by the old medieval wall, and almost all of your sightseeing is almost always within that what was the old medieval wall. Here we see Florence on the river, with a fortified bridge coming in and a wall going around it. Today the wall's long gone. You've got a circular boulevard, and the gates, some of them survive, and they ornament the traffic circles that take the road into town. During the wall, you had the road coming to the gate. The wall's gone. You still have the road coming to the gate, but the gate is no longer needed, so they make a traffic circle and they leave it there as a memorial or a souvenir of their medieval past. In the Middle Ages, it was hard to be on the waterfront because there was marauding pirates. All of the famous resorts on the Costa del Sol in Spain, they have sister towns 5 miles inland up in the hills. That's where the town was, and then when things got stable enough, they moved down to the waterfront. Once they're on the waterfront, they have castles, like here in the Cinque Terre. Every town has a castle, and this castle would be where they would holler warnings when they saw the pirates coming, and the people could run for cover. You'll find little towns in many places of Europe where the church is hidden behind a hill. You don't want a big spire sticking up in the area just to beckon to all the pirates that you've got a lot of money to build a fancy church. You have a squat spire hidden, tucked away in a valley, so pirates and marauders from the water cannot see you. If you're choosing a great city for a great capital, like, let's say, Spain, the most powerful guy in Europe, the Holy Roman Emperor in Spain, needed a fortified city for his capital. Toledo was great. It's the spiritual and artistic and historical capital of Spain today. Madrid is the modern capital because it's bigger, but until the city outgrew Toledo, Toledo was the political capital also. And Toledo is snuggled within a hairpin turn of the river. And the cool thing about a hairpin turn of a river is you just make a border, a wall across the bottom of it, and you've got a perfectly fortified town. You'll see that textbook example in Toledo. I mentioned when Rome fell, Europe was fragmented. A good example is Germany. Today, Germany is the size of Montana. In the Middle Ages, it was 200 independent little two-bit fiefdoms and dukedoms, each with its own little capital city, its own fortifications, its own customs and duties and all that kind of stuff. Here's an example. This is the town of Rothenburg. Most of us have been to Rothenburg, but until just recently, I never envisioned Rothenburg as the capital of a little country. You can see Rothenburg in the center, and then you can see the terrain of Rothenburg. Of course, Rothenburg would be really walled, but the whole terrain would have its fortification around that, and in times of serious attack, everybody could come into the walls of Rothenburg. The water mills would be vacated, and they would have to use the horse mills inside the walls of the town to do their milling, and here you have a good example of a feudal state in Germany. I mentioned if you don't like your government, try no government at all. When feudalism hit Europe with the power vacuum caused by the fall of Rome, there was a desperate need for some semblance of order. What do? You have an organization, contractual organization between landowners. They willingly work together, giving something for something. Now, if you're the biggest landowner, let's say you own all of the country, you can't really control all of the country unless you divvy up sections of it to lesser landowners. So you give out major portions to the biggest landowners. Now, they can't control all that land either until they divvy it up to other people, and then they divvy it up until it gets down to the smallest landlord. And the smallest landlord is where the landed elites connect with the landless peasants. And all the peasants, 90% of society, has to work just for subsistence by producing land for that smallest landlord. That's what we call manoralism, the manor house. And then it goes to bigger landowners, and bigger landowners. Now, feudalism is this relationship between all these wealthy elites, and you've got a two-way street. A lord gives a vassal land in return for loyalty, okay? The currency is a lord gives a vassal a fief in return for fealty. One man's vassal is another man's lord, all of them giving control of the land for loyalty. It's a fascinating thing to think about, and when you travel in Europe, you'll realize there are three parts of the feudal pie. There's this relationship between landowners and all the rich people. Their children are either the landowners or the knights, because if you're a second or third son, you don't get the land because it all goes to the oldest son. You get a nice set of armor, and you get to be a bully running around chopping things down, okay? And there's a lot of people, pent-up energy, and people with their armor and so on, and knights in the prime of life. They're lucky people, but there's nothing going on. They're anxious. They want some action. Okay, that'll stir things up. You've also got the church and the intellectual elite controlled by the church. And then you've got the lion's share of the people, 90%, 95%, whatever. All through the Middle Ages, it is the landed elites and the intellectual religious elites and the peasantry. And you've got some kind of a nice sort of democracy here. You've got the three estates. Throughout the Middle Ages in France, they would sit together when they needed to raise money for the king. He had to call the three estates. But it was always vote by house, not by show of hands. And it was always 2 against 1. You see, there could have been 200 people in the Estates General from the peasantry, because that was 90% of the people, and 100 people and 100 people, and they would still vote by house, 2 against 1. So it was always stuck. My theory about history is you got a finite pie. You can't really make it bigger, and how you slice it up is determining who's got what in society, and if everybody is stuck with or satisfied with their slice, there's not much history. If there's somebody new added to the mix and you got to redivide the pie, then there's history. For centuries, there wasn't much history in Europe because everybody is satisfied with or stuck with their slice of the pie. Then you got the advent of cities. When cities come along, you got elites in the cities, bankers, lawyers, merchants, people with money and education that don't fit into the landed nobility or the clergy. Where do you stick them? These guys say, welcome to the pie, you can sit with the peasants. Now they're in the peasantry. The peasantry now has a little bit of muscle because these guys are lawyers and rich and bankers, and they can demand a little more respect. When the king calls the assembly together, and we're moving ahead in history, but that was leading up to the French Revolution. The King of France needed to call the assembly together to raise money to fund the American revolutionaries against England. Philosophically, that was the enemy, but you have an enemy just across the way, so you're going to give money to that group, the American revolutionaries, to fight your enemy, like we see happening in modern history too. The king called the assemblies together, and the Third Estate said, wait a minute, we're not just going to give your money. I know we normally just rubber stamp it, but we're going to update this now, and we want a little more respect out of the Third Estate. And they said we should vote by show of hands instead of by house. Instead of 2-to-1, it would be 200 to 200, and maybe we can get some action here. And the king said, no way. Things got radical, and that started the French Revolution in a very simple nutshell. But you can kind of see that feudal pie and the difficulty in re-slicing it. It's a fascinating thing when you get too few people having too much power. Wow. Okay. In the year 1000, things start to kick into gear in Europe. Okay, Dark Ages are pretty dark, not much progress, not much travel, not much growth, not much innovation. And then in the year 1000, you got things starting to jiggle. Europe is starting to show itself now. People are traveling, people are trading, population is growing. There's an inventiveness. People are harnessing wind power and they're harnessing water power. They're building to last. They're building thinking it will be here in 100 years. You've got this sort of spirit, this sort of European spirit, this inventiveness, and it is stoked in a lot of ways by the Crusades. There was this pent-up energy, all these noblemen with all sorts of weapons and horses and energy, and there's no fighting going on. What am I going to do? You can only do so many medieval jousts, you know? And they had a chance to go to the Holy Land and wreak havoc. So you have the Crusades, an inglorious chapter in the story of Europe, but everybody in Europe had something to get excited about the Crusades. This is when you got bands of righteous Christians going to the Holy Land to free the holy Christian sites from the Muslims, right? Now the Pope wanted to push this because the Pope would get prestige for doing this. Landowners wanted to do it because they could get new fiefs, more landholdings. Nobles wanted to do it because they had a horse and armor and they're in the prime of life and there's no wars going on, and now they get a little bit of rape, pillage, and plunder. That would be exciting. And Christians even got on board because they thought they would win points by freeing the Holy Land from the Muslims. Everybody was excited about the Crusades. Europe got all up excited about it. Horrible thing to see and read about and sightsee. One thing that came out of the Crusades was when the forces went over to the Middle East, they found all sorts of stoneworking techniques and they brought that home with them, and Europe was able to build bigger things with the stoneworking techniques they picked up in the Middle East from the Crusades. When Europe was struggling to really get some kind of order, it's interesting the importance of the monasteries, the monastic sort of organizations around Europe. Saint Benedict founded the Benedictine order, and there's the Dominican order and the Franciscan order. And when you read about these monastic orders, they are literally thousands of churches all over Europe, and they were remarkably cohesive and well organized. And each monastic community had its own little engine, its own innovation, its own economy, and its own literacy. This is a modern portrayal of Saint Benedict with the slogan, Ora et labora. Prayer and work, all right? Prayer and work. They just worked all the time and prayed all the time, and it's a very important part of the story of Europe. Remember, in the Dark Ages, the church became a very powerful organization. The monasteries became a very powerful organization. When people died, they willed their land to the church. The church was the biggest landowner in Europe by far. The only people who could thumb their noses at a secular leader's laws were church officials. 10% of all the wealth was going down to Rome, almost required in the form of tithes. This made the church quite powerful. In the Middle Ages, the kind of travel that was most common was pilgrimages. People would go on pilgrimages, and they would walk and walk and walk. And every time I approach a great medieval church, I love to see it in the distance, and I think of myself as I try to get the energy and excitement of a pilgrim approaching on foot. Here we have the Chartres Cathedral, and you can imagine what an incredible Oz-like spire that must have been for a faithful Christian 800 years ago, walking and walking and walking to see a shroud that shows the image of Jesus, or a shroud that shows the image of Mary, or a piece of the cross, or a piece of the crown of thorns. And this was what sort of motivated all that pilgrimage action. Remember, when Christianity became the religion of Europe, they didn't just inherit the Roman temples. The problem with that is a Roman temple is designed for people to be outside. The public never went into the Roman temple. Christian churches, by their very nature, are gathering together the body of Christ on earth. The congregation sits together to worship together. You need a building that'll house a lot of people. Pagan temples wouldn't do it. What would do it is the pre-Christian Roman basilica. A basilica was a big hall of justice, a nice rectangular building with 2 rows of columns with an area in the middle where everybody could gather. So churches adopted the basilica plan. When you hear the word basilica, that is an architectural design that predates churches and Christianity, adapted by the church in the Middle Ages. Now, if you're trying to understand your medieval church architecture, there's only a few words you got to know, and it'll start to make sense. And people who write these guides to churches and stuff, they just assume you know what a transept is, or a west portal, or an apse, or an ambulatory, and you just got to get a hang on these few words. First of all, the church is facing east. The altar is always in the east, facing Jerusalem. That means the portal, the entry, is always the west. You have the west portal. It's the portal. There's only one portal. It's the west portal. Now, if you're a bird flying over that basilica, it just looks like a box. You need to sprout transepts, and it starts to look like a cross. Much better. So you take your boxy rectangular basilica, and you sprout transepts. Because the church always faces east, you can only have a north and a south transept. So don't worry about west and east transept. You've got a north transept and a south transept. These are designed to accommodate pilgrims. On a certain feast day or a special saint's day, hordes of people converge on that church, and they amble in, they walk in, they circulate right around that thing, and they amble out to the main square where the party's going on. That's what you have an ambulatory for. The outer row where you amble all along, checking out each of the little chapels that line the side and the transepts, that's the ambulatory. Behind the high altar, in the very extreme eastern end, you've got a semicircular area, which is called the apse. And near the high altar, there's an area called the choir. We think of choir as a singing group, but a choir in architectural terms is a little church within the church. This is a cozy place that could be heated and intimate in the middle of a vast stony building. The choir is where you'll see an evensong service. When you go to England, you'll sit in the choir. There's a mass every day in these churches, and it's given in the choir, and so on. So if you know those basic words, I think you have a good start on understanding the terminology assumed of you when it comes to describing a medieval church. This is the church of the Basilica of St. Francis. And the Basilica of St. Francis is just designed for pilgrims, you can imagine, because all the pilgrims would come there to see the relics of St. Francis in Assisi. So around the church is a whole bunch of associated buildings that were there for lots of visitors, pilgrims coming in. The first European art style is Romanesque. Romanesque is a small, stubby, thick-walled, small-windowed, dark interior, fortress of God kind of church. This is the earliest Romanesque churches, dating from about the year 1000. They feel like fortresses of God. Some of them even have crenulated towers where you can hide behind with your bow and arrow, you know, because these were places of last refuge in a town that didn't have a wall. When you think about Romanesque, remember, the carving is very flat, cluttered, and narrative. It's just comic book kind of images so you can read a story. It doesn't need to be realistic. They don't care how honest and realistic it looks. You just got to identify, there's a woman with a dead child on her lap. That would be a Pietà. Here's a guy with a bushy beard and a key. That would be Peter. And it was just all that symbolism. The best place to look for the best carvings of the age is called the tympanum. The tympanum is the semicircular area over the door. Okay, look up there and you'll see the best carvings of that church. The most famous, I think, work of art of the 11th century, I think, would be the Bayeux tapestry. And the Bayeux tapestry is sort of medieval style art. It's telling a story. If you don't understand that that's Edward, it says Edward up above. And there's all sorts of dead soldiers below. And this is about a 50-yard long embroidery that goes around the church celebrating the Battle of Hastings, when the Normans went over to England and won. 1066, that's one of the key days. I don't remember many dates. If I bring up a date today, this is worth remembering. Battle of Hastings, 1066, the Normans invading England from France. And when you think of the Normans invading France, they bring with them their architectural style, which is Romanesque. But when you go to England, you don't find Romanesque, you find Norman architecture. If somebody refers to Norman architecture, that's the Romanesque brought over by the Normans. A good example of Romanesque architecture in England is in London, the Tower of London, built for William the Conqueror. And this was the fortress of London. And when you go inside that fortress, you can see a glorious Romanesque or Norman chapel. And when we look at this chapel, we can see why Romanesque is called Romanesque. Romanesque is called Romanesque because of the Roman-style columns and round arches. Roman columns, Roman arches, Romanesque, year 1000. This is the Pisan Romanesque. The town of Pisa has a great ensemble on its Piazza of Miracles. You've got the church, you've got the bell tower, and you've got the baptistry. And when you have a medieval church complex, it always has those three elements. So do remember when you're sightseeing, you've got the great church, but in the Middle Ages, you could not go into the church until you were baptized. So you had to have the baptistry outside of the church. The baptistry in Pisa, the baptistry in Florence, across the square from the church. And then you've got the bell tower. In the case of Pisa, the leaning bell tower, and that's where you'd have the bells ringing the hours, ringing when it's time to celebrate, ringing when you're under attack, ringing when there's a fire. People didn't have watches, people didn't have radios. You had to listen to the bell to know what was going on. Italy is known as the land of 1,000 bell towers. People have a psychological sort of trait called campanilismo. They love the sound of their town's bell tower. If my town, Edmonds, had a bell tower, I would have campanilismo. When I get home, I'd hear the sound of my bell tower, and I think, yes, I'm home. In each town, they would have a little glockenspiel, the bells that play, and they would go rattle, 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 doody-doo-doo. I'm paying attention. I'm glad I live here. Bong, bong, bong. It's 3 o'clock. Or they would go fancier, fancier, and then suddenly, bum, 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 bum. I'm so proud to live in this town. Bum, 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 3 o'clock. So you have those bell towers. You can climb to a lot of them and see those glockenspiels, the keyboard worth of bells that they have up there. It's fun to go to the top of the leaning tower. It's not leaning this much, but it is a very tilty place to go to the top of. Now, the next big change is Gothic. And when you have Gothic, you've got a lighter interior. This is a big break. This is the High Middle Ages now. About the year 1200, we see Gothic replacing Romanesque. And when you look at a Gothic church, you're seeing pointed arches and you're seeing more windows. You've still got the tympanum above each of those doors. On the west portal, you see the tympanum. Now it's pointed instead of semicircular because of the pointed arches, but that's where the best carvings are. That's where you'll see a lot of stuff to look at. This happens to be the Notre Dame, the great Gothic cathedral in Paris. I want to remind you, when they set out to build these things, they knew it was going to take more than 100 years. Nobody who dedicated their life to starting this building would be around to see it finished, but they dedicated their lives to the church. That was an important part of their communities, even though they would never see it finished. When you step inside, you see the beauty of Gothic. The whole triumph of Gothic is to make the walls skeletal supporters so they can now not support the roof, but open up for windows, you see. A Gothic church is a masterful playing off against architectural forces, so the walls don't need to be stubby and thick to hold the stone ceiling, but so the walls can just be window holders. And there you see the ribs, bringing that skeleton of support to keystones on the top. The best way for me as a tour guide to demonstrate Gothic architecture is to build a Gothic cathedral out of tourists. Now, I'll use the photograph instead of asking for 12 volunteers here, or 13 volunteers, but it takes 13 tourists to make a Gothic cathedral. Follow me here. You got 6 columns, so you get volunteers, and you got 3 columns here and 3 columns facing us. These are columns. Each has ribs coming together. Forget the elbows. Forget rib is not here. Architecturally speaking, this is a rib that goes to the top of the roof. Now, when you have your spire, 4 ribs coming together here and 4 ribs over here, when you have your spire hoisting himself up, the weight of that spire, if it's a round arch, is going to go straight down. And you're going to need stronger knees, fatter knees, no room for windows. If you point the arch up, you don't need a stronger wall anymore. The weight of the spire when he hoists himself up, because it's pointed, pushes you out. So instead of stronger walls, you need buttresses to push the walls in. So you ask for 6 volunteers, and the buttresses come prancing up. They stand flush against the columns, and then you want to free up even more room on the wall, so you ask the buttress to take 1 step back and fly in with your support. Flying buttresses, okay? Now you've got that skeleton of support. You got your flying buttresses, you got your columns, you got your ribs, you got your pointed arches, and you got a strong, wiry, lightweight person, I hope, that hoists himself up to be the spire, and it's all solid as can be. And that's the essence of Gothic. And if you're ever having a party that's just not going over very well, you can say, hey, let's build a Gothic cathedral. It just takes 13 of us. You can see these beautiful flying buttresses. You can see the pointed arches. It's fun to know about that before you step into these churches. Remember, and by the way, when I say cathedral, that just means the seat of a bishop. Cathedra is the word for the throne of the bishop. So if there's a bishop there, and if that's his church, that's a cathedral. St. Peter's in Rome is the most important church in Christendom. It's not a cathedral because it's not the home of a bishop, right? Little tiny towns can have a cathedral. Wells in England is the smallest city. A city is the name of a town that has a bishop. So technically, Wells is a city and its church is a cathedral. In Italy, you hear the word Duomo a lot. Duomo is the Italian word for cathedral. Now here we have the facade of the Reims Cathedral. And it's just one of the great Gothic cathedrals. And I like it because it's beautifully floodlit. It's the lacy, grand example of a west portal on a Gothic church. And at night, they have a sound and light show. And it looks garish, but this is really cool because this is a reminder that these churches were originally painted like this. Hard to believe. But when you think of the white Gothic statues and the white Gothic facades, you got to remember that this is the color scheme of those churches 800 years ago, and all of that paint is gone now. All sorts of beautiful churches. They used to be surrounded by graveyards, and now those graveyards are pulled up during the Napoleonic age and parked elsewhere, so you've got open space around the churches. Churches went taller and taller and taller until they actually started falling down. This is the Cologne Cathedral in Germany, one of the tallest cathedrals. In Italy, they had Gothic architecture, but because I believe that they were sitting on the rubble of Rome, they had a more classic aesthetic, and they didn't like tall spires. It was just tense and not very stable to them. They wanted things to be squat, stable, symmetrical, not so towering, and they would have less tall churches, but they would make up for the grandeur by really decorating the western port. So you've got facades like these churches in Orvieto and in Siena that are just like, you know, just fruitcake kind of fancy, and you got that in Italy. And now the architecture evolves until it reaches what's called flame-like Gothic. That's the final stage of Gothic, flamboyant Gothic, and that's the last stage of Gothic before it sort of collapses and is replaced by the Renaissance. Here we have the cathedral in Milano, and this is spires upon spires upon spires, frilly ornate. The same thing happens inside. You had the pure ribs, and then they get more and more decorative until you have fan vaulting. That's as they get fancier and fancier and forget the simplicity of the original churches. When we look at that stained glass, we got to remember this was so important in the Middle Ages. People were not literate. They went to church 1 day a week. This was their break from the drudgery of their peasant lives. And they'd step into church. And back then, if ever religion was the opiate of the masses, it was back then. They'd step into church and they'd read the beautiful Bible stories, and it made sense to them. And teachers could use this as an example. And it's not my idea of necessarily a great time to spend half an hour with a scholar explaining every window. But once in your life, it's nice for somebody to give you an idea of how sophisticated and cohesive the sermons are in each of these windows. Malcolm Miller does that in Chart, and it's just brilliant. If you get a chance to go to Chartres, be sure you take his tour. But here we have a window at Chartres Cathedral, and I forget exactly examples, but you got images demonstrating Jesus' life going up the middle. On the left, you'd have Old Testament. On the right, you'd have New Testament parallel lessons, and it all reaches some beautiful biblical sort of finale on top. It's all tied together. And when we look at those windows, we are just, I think, blown away by the fact that the High Middle Ages were pretty darn sophisticated. They would make the stained glass by melting minerals into the molten glass or by painting it after it was already baked. And then they would put it together in these lead sort of borders. Remember, throughout the Middle Ages, the church was the noble endeavor. You could have art as long as it decorated the church. And the craftspeople that made the art were anonymous. They were not supposed to be famous. Nobody knew who was making all these beautiful things. They were anonymous craftspeople. This guy's name's Adam Kraft, and he's the first sort of architect that actually honored himself by sneaking a self-portrait in. And this is a reminder that things are about to change when we step into the Renaissance. But in the Middle Ages, it was all to the glory of God. You had exquisite art celebrating the Virgin Mary, and you had exquisite art reminding you who the saint was that you should be thankful for, and so on. In Barcelona, St. George is the patron saint, so you got St. George everywhere you look. If you go to England and you find a church dedicated to St. Michael, you can pretty much bet that church was built on a pre-Christian pagan holy spot because St. Michael was in charge of tamping down the evil spirits. And they would park St. Michael on that church in order to keep those evil spirits from the pagan holy spot from corrupting what was going on in the church. If you're in Paris and you see a guy holding his head in his hand, that's got to be St. Denis, because according to the story about St. Denis, he was an early martyr and got his head chopped off. And you will recognize these symbols as you travel, and you'll be able to read beautiful Bible stories into beautiful church art when you enjoy the churches of the Middle Ages. Remember, until now, you didn't need to be realistic. You don't need to understand the body. You don't need to know really how a dead body lays on his mother's lap. It can be just a papier-mâché Jesus on Mary's lap, and that tells you that is a Pietà. Of course, that will change when we get Michelangelo and the Renaissance. Back then, people looked at art because it told a story. Here you got 20 or 30 pages, all telling a story. When you looked at an altarpiece in the church, you would find above the high altar the most important piece of art in that town in a lot of cases, and a lot of times it'd be carved, and behind that would be canvases, and you would have many panels going back and forth. This is a polyptych, a many-paneled altarpiece that could swing and show you different scenes depending on the time of year, or you could have a simple triptych, 3 panels that would come together, and half of each scene on the back would come together and show you a full scene. The last great Gothic painter, and maybe the first of the modern painters, is Giotto. He preceded the Renaissance by about 100 years, and if you want to see Giotto's work, you can see a lot of it in the great cultural centers of Italy. Perhaps the best collection of Giotto is in Padua, where you can find the Scrovini Chapel. And you step into this chapel, and the entire thing is frescoed by Giotto and his aides and students, and we find here a cohesive story that just tells the life of Mary or the life of Jesus or whatever. And when you look at this, you see powerful visual images that were really effective teachers 600 years ago. Also, when we look at this, we are looking at frescoes. You hear the word fresco a lot. It's not technically a painting. Fresco is mixing the pigments into the wet plaster. It was very permanent, and you had to be very fast, because when it was dry. But it survives a lot better than canvas, all right? So fresco artists, and a lot of this art is fresco, they would draw a cartoon on the wall, and then they would mix the color into the plaster, and they would apply it to the wall. They'd rough up the wall so the plaster would stick to it, and when the plaster dried, the color was the wall. I mean, it was so strong. And you'll see frescoes all over in your travels. A beautiful thing about going to, for instance, the Scrovini Chapel is you follow the whole story through. It always culminates with a Judgment Day. Here you have Jesus coming down on Judgment Day. On one side, people are going to heaven, and on the other side, these are the people going to heaven, and on the other side are people just kicking off a pretty miserable eternity, going to hell. And I just love to look at these hell scenes and get a sense of the power of the church to scare people into towing the line from a church obedience point of view. All of this art now is paid for, and you got to ask yourself who paid for it and why, what was going on. And if you look at a lot of the art, you can get an indication of what medieval guild would have paid for it. If you've got a beautiful church in your town and it needs a nice new door, perhaps the carpenters or the masons or the drapers will pay for that. If the carpenters pay for it, they'll hire somebody to make this niche and put a statue of St. George or whatever, and in the bottom you would have a little ad that says, "This program was brought to you by the generous people at the Cobblers Guild. Remember, next time you need a shoe, these are good people, they gave this to your church," all right? And that would be the advertising of the Middle Age, and you'd see that in the church. Remember, acidic air has wreaked havoc on all sorts of precious art. And what we need to do is be thankful that the church has taken the statues off of the churches now, all over Europe, and put them in museums associated with the church. And this is one of the great underrated attractions in Europe. Most travelers just go to the church, because there it is. It's right there. It's front and center. It's big. It's free. It's dramatic. But the great art is across the street in the museum of the church. And we're kind of tired by the time we get there. Give some energy to seeing the Museo del Duomo, that's in Florence. They've got the Museo dell'Opera del Duomo, where you've got all sorts of great art on how they made the church and the great art that used to be in the niches of the church. When you go to these museums associated with the church, you get to see the originals, even though their faces are all rotted because of 800 years of air. You get to see the originals where the new ones are stuck in the niches today, and you get some fun little glimpses at the history of that church. For instance, gargoyles. Gargoyles are fascinating. They're storm drains, right, on the edge of the buildings. And on a rainstorm, the water would spew out. You hear about when there's a big fire in a church, the copper panels of the rooftop melt because of the fire. I've always heard about this. The molten copper was cascading down the church. And I just thought, what a horrible thought. But I couldn't really imagine the roof becoming molten, metal. And then in this museum, I saw a gargoyle that was because of the storm of molten copper coming down off of the roof, or lead. He was spewing out the molten metal, and then it got solid, and right there we can see that very odd little souvenir of a terrible fire in a church somewhere in France. You needed a lot of castles to protect all of these petty little countries. And you've got the very earliest castles, which are generally this motte and bailey design. A motte and a bailey means a man-made mound and a Boonesborough-type stockade. And you'll see that motte and bailey in your travels. For instance, when you travel in Ireland, you can actually see some classic old, melted ice cube or sugar cube kind of motte and bailey structures. When you go to York, there's a motte with a Castle Clifford's Tower right on the top. When you're traveling through medieval sites, you need to remember it took money to build beautiful towns and to fortify them so they would survive. The most beautiful, popular tourist towns today are probably so beautiful because they were great trading towns 600 or 800 years ago. Rothenburg is everybody's favorite medieval German town. Crossroads of two trading routes, lots of trade there in Rothenburg, consequently, beautiful buildings that survive to this day. In the very earliest days, it was too expensive to build a stone building, so they would do it with timbers, and they would fill in the timbers with mud and cow pies and so on, and then they would plaster over that. Wattle and daub. You see a lot of that in thatched buildings in England. Of course, that's the building of a poor person. If you're a rich person, you have a stone building. If you're a poor person that wants to look richer than you are, you build a wattle and daub building, and then you plaster it over, and you pretend that that is stone. A lot of people covered up their wattle and daub half-timbered look because that was low class. And then in the modern times, people found the wattle and daub, the half-timbered look, more charming and more profitable from a tourism point of view. So they peeled away their fake stone and proudly showed their half-timberedness, like this oldest town and the oldest building in Bacharach on the Rhine River. I bet one day it was covered up with stucco, so it looked like a stone building. And then in the modern era, they peeled away the stucco to reveal the half-timbered. Many towns burned down because they were all fire, all wood, and got to the point where they decreed, like in Oslo, you can't have a building in the town center unless it is made out of stone. A lot of times people would cheat on that, and they would have a stone facade, and if you go into the courtyard or on the back, you can still see that half-timbered wattle and daub sneaking through. The trade in the Middle Ages was on the river. You had all these petty little kingdoms along the river. They each had a castle. These were the original robber baron castles. They would levy duty from the boats that come down the river. This is False Castle, actually a castle in the middle of the river with a chain going out on both sides. Boats coming down the river, they hoist their chain. You can't go by until you pay your duty. Then they drop the chain and you can carry on to the next robber baron castle. You can imagine why city merchants were the original supporters of kings that wanted to create big national units, because that would give them better free trade. Free trade. Hanseatic League was a way to get around all those petty things and had a trading arrangement between all these great cities. The feudal lords were really found it convenient for Europe to be fragmented because they could levy all those duties, and today Europe is getting more and more free trade until the EU is the final development of that, and you got 400 million people that all have free trade. But in the old days, it was just the opposite of that, all these robber baron castles. When you go around Europe and you find the mightiest castles, a lot of times these are castles that are not from the people where the castle is located, but from the conquerors that came in. If you go to Iraq today, you'll probably find a lot of fortresses that were built with American help as we came in and tried to stabilize things there. When you go to Wales today, you'll find a lot of castles built by England, who wanted to stabilize things. They wanted to keep down the insurgents. You keep down the insurgents by having castles with green zones attached to the castles. In Baghdad, you fly in like this, down to the green zone where you have your castle. In the old days, of course, you didn't have a flight pattern like this for safety. You came in by boat, which was safe. So you look at the castles in Wales, and generally there'll be a mighty castle with a fortified port and then a grid-planned garrison town within walls. And that was the English foothold in that part of Wales, surrounded by angry indigenous people. You'll find more castles per square mile in Wales than almost anywhere else. These are amazing castles, and you want to check them out for sure when you're traveling in Wales. Remember, when you have a little country, you have a castle that would be the center of that, and it would have the ability to house most of the town and the troops there when they're under attack, and that means you have to have a big pantry. There are huge cellars where they would keep provisions for the times when they were under siege. And before the advent of cannons, the defenses were stronger than the offenses, and the standard warfare was siege warfare. Surround them, we'll never break through, we'll just starve them out. So you'd have to have a well, and you'd have a big pantry and lots of food, and wait it out. Warfare was really boring back then. Later on, they developed cannons, and things changed. Also remember, when you're sightseeing, in the Middle Ages, because of this lack of central powers, big shots, the Rockefellers and the local families, the Medici, whoever, they would have their own, they were warlords, they would have their own armies, and they would have their own fortifications. Think of the Montagues and the Capulets in Verona from Romeo and Shakespeare's story. Those were two families, each with their own armies and probably each with their own fortified towers. All the towns in Italy had these noble family towers which threatened the king. So whenever you'd have a strong central power, he would likely say, I'm offended by all these noble families with their towers, tear down your towers. There's only one town in Italy that has its medieval, bristly, noble family skyline surviving, and that's San Gimignano. And that's where you see all of these towers. Not unique to San Gimignano, uniquely surviving in San Gimignano. Each one of those towers would be the fortress of a wealthy family. I mentioned early castles were stronger than the offense, and you could just build a tall castle and say, you can't come in. But when cannons came along, they could knock those castles down really easy. So what you get after the age of cannon is squat castles. They don't want to stand on top of a hill saying, come and get it. They're squat, they're crouching down, and their walls are 30 feet thick. And you can pummel it with cannonballs all day long and not get through. So when you see a modern-day castle, like here in Lucca, or in the fortress around Milano, you're going to see a cannon-hardened castle, and that's bringing in the modern age. Remember, a lot of these palaces in the countryside and royal fortified palaces and everything were pretty Spartan. If they were a palace for the king only came a few times in his lifetime, and they would have, the royal party was moving around, and they would have, I think you'd call them the royal equivalent of roadies that went ahead and set up the place when the king and his entourage arrived. In France, you find a lot of that. When you go to the different palaces and countryside castles and chateaux, each one had a room fit for a king. And when the king came, they would furnish it. The French word for furniture is mobile, right? And the furniture was all collapsible. They could fold up the tables, fold up the chairs, grab the chests with handles on them, put them on their wagons, and go to the next chateau. So when you look at your royal furniture, remember it all fits in a wagon. The walls were cold and drafty, and you would have your whole royal collection of tapestries. You'd hang up there to warm up the place, and the tapestries were sort of the newsletters of the day. They would tell folk wisdom. They would tell whatever has happened politically. They would make the king feel good. You'll find exquisite tapestries all over medieval Europe, warming up the walls of these otherwise barren chateaux. When France, which had a lot of castles, became established, suddenly you've got a fortifying castle, a defensive castle in the middle of a very stable country. You don't need it anymore. These morph into hunting lodges and luxury getaways for kings and their mistresses. All right? All along the Loire Valley, you find chateaus that originated as defensive castles that became ridiculous from a defense point of view, and they just became really over-the-top, ostentatious getaways for royals. Like Chambord, shown here. 440 rooms. This was a hunting palace for the king. He rarely came there. If you look at Chenonceau, again, it's an over-the-top castle that has no defensive purposes. This is a party house run by the king's mistress and decorated with a real feminine touch. A lot of the castles were very feminine because they were the ones with unlimited budgets and not off on crusades or off fighting, but they're at home busying themselves by decorating up some fancy chateau. When we look at what we've just talked about, in the Middle Ages, the Dark Ages go from 500 to 1000. And you've got the fall of Rome, meaning barbarians are going all over the place throughout this age. You've got monasteries providing some semblance of order around Europe, as that was really the shadow of Rome's structure of rule. The rule of Charlemagne is the only important sort of big political event in the middle of the Dark Ages. Byzantium was former-day Constantinople. It is Istanbul, what Istanbul is today. It came well into Europe, and it even threatened Vienna at one point. And Islam cuts across Africa and moves all into Spain. So that was kind of what we see in a blotchy kind of way in the first half of the Middle Ages. When we look at the High Middle Ages, we still have Byzantium and we still have Islam, but what we have here is Europe coming into the fore. We've got that first European art style, Romanesque, which goes from 1000 to 1200. We've got Gothic picking it up from there until the Renaissance, and we got the Renaissance kicking in around the year 1400. At this point, Europe is still Eurocentric. Maps show a fuzzy understanding of where the world ends. It's just kind of scary. Woe to ye who sail beyond this point. Dragons live over there. And you've got Jerusalem in the center, okay? So it's a Christian-centric, a Eurocentric map with no sense of the rest of the world. That's going to change. You've got an inkling now of humanism, where people are getting it together. This is the city hall on the main square, standing like an exclamation point, declaring, we can figure this out, and that's the people in the city-state of Siena in Italy. They're starting to come together that way. There's an alertness. It's still a church-dominated world, but there's an alertness, and Europe is ready to step out of the Middle Ages and into the Renaissance. And that's where we're going next. Thank you very much.